start by saying welcome, everybody. So glad that you could join us for another Zoom meeting. Of course, we would love to be in Israel. We'd love to be on a Chizuk mission, but since we can't be there, we're doing our best to bring the best of Israel to you. Today, we have with us Aharon Pulver, who is someone that we meet with, every time we go to Israel. And there's always something new, something exciting, a development, a new project that he gets to share with us, and he never lets us down. So let me just tell you a little bit about him. By the way, I said I'm Judy Friedman-Kadish and this is AFSI, right? So anyway, today's topic is the American and Israeli political scene. What is the outlook? And we have Aharon, whose work is to advocate on behalf of the protection of the Jewish, Zionist, and democratic character of the State of Israel. His involvement in these crucial issues and contact with those who are on the front lines fighting for these ideals gives him the experience and insight to evaluate the situation confronting Israel with its new leadership vis-a-vis the US and the new leadership here. So Aharon is the executive director of the Israel Independence Fund. Founded in 2007 and led by its executive director, Aharon Pulver, together with a very devoted board. The fund plays a unique role in helping Israel to realize its continuing vision as a strong, secure, and uniquely Jewish state, devoted to the welfare and the future of our people and to the values of Zionism and democracy. Aharon is the executive director. He's lived in Israel for 40 years. That's quite a time span. And it's provided him with the proximity, the contacts, connections, and the understanding necessary to spearhead the mission of the Israel Independence Fund. That mission is to work with NGOs, and those NGOs are tackling some of Israel's most pressing issues. Very often, it is like an incubator for people with wonderful ideas who need a head start to get them off the ground and to get them continuing to do their wonderful work. But they are people who are tackling some of the most important issues facing Israel today. And Aharon works with the NGOs and also with leaders. He mentors people who eventually go on to become Knesset members, ministers. And so the connections are all there and the knowledge is all there, and we are so glad that he is right here to share his wisdom with us. So welcome, Aharon. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Judy, for inviting me to meet with so many friends and acquaintances from the United States primarily, and some friends and acquaintances from Israel as well. This evening here in Israel and in the afternoon on the East Coast. I'm particularly gratified to have been invited by AFSI, an organization of true leadership from the United States that the Israel Independence Fund has been involved with for many, many years. AFSI is an organization which I have tremendous respect for. I have never seen an American Jewish organization like AFSI, which travels the length and breadth of Israel, truly, from the heartland to its periphery, to show the true issues to an American Jewish and an American non-Jewish constituency that regularly participates in AFSI programming. So on the one hand, I'm tremendously grateful to AFSI for the unbelievable advocacy work that you do. And I'm tremendously gratified that you have me here this evening to speak to people. I should mention as well that Judy is also a member of the board of directors of the Israel Independence Fund. And in that capacity, wearing two hats, Judy is very much involved, not only in Israel advocacy through AFSI, but in actually keeping boots on the ground here in Israel in order to affect positive change and in order to strengthen the Jewish and Zionist ethos of Israel. So thank you, Judy. It's wonderful to be here with everybody this evening. The title of my discussion this evening with you all is about American and Israeli politics. And I prefer, with your permission, to focus on what's going on here in Israel. I feel like I have a better handle on it. And clearly that has a tremendous effect on how Israel reflects in the United States and American policy and American politics to an extent. But I'll speak mostly about what's going on in Israel today. In the 45 years I've lived in Israel, I cannot remember a time where I could not say that it's a challenging time. It's always a challenging time in the Middle East. We only have to look around us in the rings that encircle Israel to understand how challenging it has always been, and most likely how challenging it will be not only in the near future, but in the far future as well. The recent events in Afghanistan only bring home in a very eloquent fashion that for the most part, populations in the Middle East outside of this tiny country are certainly not ready for anything that looks even remotely like Western democracy. The United States has tried for 20 years to inculcate Western democratic values in a country not too far away from us called Afghanistan, and that's failed miserably. And not only has America's military doctrine failed in Afghanistan, but clearly the civil doctrine of inculcating those values in a Middle Eastern population has not worked. Israeli politics are always complicated because we're surrounded by rings. And the closest ring to Israel is extremely challenging in and of itself, simply because of its proximity. The countries that surround us, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, are countries that do not reflect necessarily the will of the people who live in those countries. And they're countries in which there is still a high level of risk for Israel, despite the fact that Israel has peace agreements with Egypt and with Jordan. Neither of those countries are really all that stable. Egypt, at the moment, enjoys stability because of a military coup d'etat that displaced an Islamic government that was voted in by the people. And thanks to that military coup d'etat, Israel has a very close security relationship with the Egyptian government, which is good for now. However, everybody in Israel is cognizant of the fact that that could change. The Hashemites on our eastern border have always been a huge question mark simply because of their own staying ability. The Hashemite kingdom of Jordan is a family business. There's no other way to describe it. It's a family business that was established in 1922 by demarking 78% of what was then known as Mandatory Palestine from the area that was supposed to comprise the Jewish state. The Hashemites have never been all that stable, and they maintain their stability simply by authoritarian rule. And recently, we've seen moves by the Hashemite kingdom to curry great favor with the Iranians to the extent that they're actually encouraging Iranian tourism to Jordan and encouraging the Iranian people to look as Jordan as a playground and a very price-effective playground. and are anticipating millions of Iranian citizens coming to Jordan to enjoy Jordanian recreational facilities. That alone is a sign of the times, a sign of a strengthened Iran, thanks to the American administration, and a sign of great worry for Israel. To the north of the Hashemite kingdom, of course, we have Syria. And despite the fact that Assad has brutally murdered what most people estimate, what most authorities estimate to be almost 500,000 of his own people, he is now in a very much strengthened position. And we see in Syria massive Russian, Chinese, and Iranian investments. Russian military bases exist in Syria, not too far from our northern border. And the situation there is very worrisome because we see Syria ascending. Lebanon, of course, is a morass. It's a failed state. Thanks to Hezbollah, Lebanon is perhaps the new international basket case. It's gone from being the Switzerland of the Middle East to being Zimbabwe of the Middle East, with over 50% of its population having no nutrition safety whatsoever. People are hungry in the streets in Beirut. And the instability of Lebanon only allows Hezbollah even greater control of that country and only allows Hezbollah to continue to build infrastructure. Most recently, reports in Israel that were declassified once again pointed a damning finger to the North Koreans. And recent reports have indicated that an underground highway system has been tunneled into Lebanon, allowing Hezbollah units to transport missiles from one far-flung base to another in order to be able to more effectively use weaponry against us. Previously, it's been known that the North Koreans were involved in digging terror tunnels that go under our northern border into the northern part of Israel. We've discovered many of those. I'm not so sure we've discovered them all, but we've discovered many of them. And I'm not so sure that others aren't being built. But North Korean activity on our northern border has been going on for years now. So the close ring to Israel is a ring that remains, despite the Abraham Accords and despite the best optimism, a very dangerous zone for Israel. Of course, the secondary ring surrounding Israel, that includes Iran, includes Turkey, is not something that's favorable to us. The Turks continue to be controlled by an Islamic party, and Erdogan's party is perhaps one of the most anti-Semitic regimes that the world has known other than the Iranians for the past 75 years. We don't have to say much about Iran. Everybody knows exactly what's going on there and exactly what they think of us and exactly what they'd like to do with us. The debacle in Afghanistan speaks very clearly to us here in Israel as to a number of cardinal points that we must never forget. Cardinal point number one is that when push comes to shove, we're on our own. We have no illusions that in a worst case scenario, it's Israeli boots on the ground that are going to do the fighting, Israeli boots on the ground that are going to carry the day. And in the best of cases, we could count on equipment and support, perhaps diplomatic support from our friends in the United States, but beyond that, not much. The other thing to be remembered is that despite the best efforts, as I said at the beginning of my comments, Western democratic principles don't work well with most Middle Eastern populations. The Middle East is not ready for American style or European style democracy. It's just not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because of the different societal differences that do exist. And I wish it were otherwise, but I'm afraid it's not. Here in Israel, for many years, it appeared that the government well understood some of the cardinal facts that I find very troubling. In the past several months, I've become increasingly concerned that there is less understanding for some of the cardinal facts about the Middle East, and there is more emphasis on wishful thinking. I think that one of the things that has divided the right and the left in Israel for decades is not so much the difference in where we'd like to be at the end of the day, but in how we see things and how we view things in a real concrete manner, with the left very much being optimistic and wishful thinkers, and the right wanting to get to the same place that the left wants to go, a peaceful, happy Middle East, but being clearly more sensitive to the facts on the ground and understanding the dangers involved. I'm sure you are all aware that 3 days ago, missiles were once again fired on Sderot. And unfortunately, to this day, the government has not yet responded to that brazen attack. Our prime minister gave a press conference barely an hour ago on national television here in Israel, in which he stated that the time frame for Israeli military's response will not be dictated by our enemies. That's a line that Ehud Barak usually gave whenever he lacked the determination to respond to Arab provocations when he was prime minister. I'm afraid that our current prime minister lacks an understanding of Israel's need to be an independent actor. Many of you may have heard that despite the previous agreements that Israel had with Vladimir Putin, the security arrangements that were established by Benjamin Netanyahu with the Russian government are no longer in effect. And Vladimir Putin has said in no uncertain terms that Israeli responses to military threat from Syria and attacks from Syria will no longer be given an automatic green light. It's also become apparent that the green light that we previously had and the coordination that was previously established with Russian military forces on our northern border has been stopped because the Russians now perceive Israel as being a extension of the American military, to the extent that Naftali Bennett has guaranteed the American government that they will have a veto on our actions. When the present government guaranteed the American Secretary of State and the American President that we would conduct a military policy of no surprises, they basically let the Israeli public know that without an American okay, our forces can't launch. And immediately thereafter, our security cooperation agreements with Russia were canceled. Actions like that lead me to believe that we have a lot to be concerned about. And I'm sure you all are as concerned as I. It seems as well that there is a level of cooperation between the current Israeli government and the American administration that never existed before in terms of not only military policy, but foreign policy. All of a sudden, we have woken to a foreign ministry that internationalizes the Holocaust and changes the Holocaust into a Holocaust from amongst many Holocausts, something that very much resonates the type of philosophy that has been proposed by European governments in whitewashing their own despicable history towards the Jewish people. Most recently, Yair Lapid spoke at a conference in Europe, a conference on anti-Semitism, in which he specifically said that the Holocaust is just one of many that has occurred. And by diluting the special nature of the Holocaust, one dilutes not only its message, but it dilutes the ability of other people to learn from it. And I can't think of anything that's sadder. However, just to show that there is a lack of professionalism in the foreign ministry that should lead us all to concern, not only did our current foreign minister do that, but he precipitated a foreign policy disaster with the current Polish government by making a mountain out of a molehill. The Polish government recently passed legislation changing the rules of law as concerns the restitution of Jewish property in Poland. Previously, Jews who demanded the restitution of property that was confiscated, stolen by the Nazis or by the communists after 1948 from Jews in Poland could do it by going to a municipality and proving to the municipality without going to a court of law that they were the previous owners in the municipality in the city, town in question would return the property to the Jewish owners, which was a policy that the Polish government allowed and which the Israeli government requested over 25 years ago in order to simplify the restitution of Jewish property. The Polish government wanted to change that because they felt that without Polish courts being involved, that policy was wide open to people taking advantage of it. The Israeli government negotiated, Netanyahu's government negotiated a deal with the Polish authorities, with the Polish government, on the language of a new law to be established, to be passed by the Polish parliament, which would allow Jews to receive their property back, but would simply require that they go to a court of law to prove ownership. When that law was passed, Yair Lapid jumped out of his seat, screaming holy murder, and precipitated a crisis with one of Israel's closest allies in Eastern Europe. And it's a crisis which I don't see quieting down because he continues to pour oil on the fire, even though the law that was passed by the Polish parliament was negotiated with the Israeli government and approved by the Israeli government and the Israeli foreign ministry less than a year ago. This lack of professionalism is evident in our defense policy. It's evident in our foreign policy, and it's also evident in our health policy. I don't see the current government dealing with issues related to the coronavirus in a manner that is as effective and as determined and as clear as the previous governments. All things considered, I'm concerned. But one of the things that most concerns me is the fact that prior to the past elections, Yair Lapid disappeared from the map and went to Washington, D.C. and spent several days there, days for which he will not account. And my gut tells me, once again, I have no proof of this, I'm just thinking out loud together with you folks, that while he was in Washington, D.C., he probably met with people in whose interest the change of government was primary. The change of government here in Israel was primary. And I could think of a lot of names from America's recent political past and from America's current political present that would probably have loved to see change in Israel's government and probably had some level of discussion with Yair Lapid about that change and about the inclusion of Islamic parties in coalition governments here in Israel. The inclusion of Mansour Abbas and the Ra'am party in the current government is a watershed event that is uniquely dangerous to Israel's future as a Jewish and Zionist state. Never before has such an anti-Israel, anti-Zionist voice sat within the powers of government in this country. Now, Israel has seen Arab ministers before. Israel has seen Druze ministers before. Israel has seen Arab participation and support of Israeli governments before from outside the coalition. And that happened as early as 1949, when the Israel Labor Party created satellite parties that were Arab parties that routinely voted with the Labor Party on every issue in this country. But they were outside supporters, not inside supporters sitting at the government table. This is the first time in Israel's history that we have not only an Arab party, but a clearly anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, Islamic Arab party sitting at the table. And many people have said to me over the past weeks that it was an idea that was broached by Bibi Netanyahu. That's not really true. I have it from a number of people who were intimately involved in negotiations and intimately involved in the Likud, that was not the deal that Netanyahu was talking about. Never was. Netanyahu had approached Mansour Abbas only about supporting the government from outside the government, as being a outside voice that would vote along with the government in no confidence motions. Never did Bibi Netanyahu think of bringing in the Ra'am party, which is a radical Islamic party vehemently opposed to a Jewish state in the land of Israel, as a government member. We have a situation in Israel that politically only adds concern to the increasingly radical Middle East that we see surrounding us today. Together with that, I will touch a little bit on American policy to say that the American defense policy in the Middle East and the American political policy in the Middle East, foreign policy in the Middle East, is of great concern to us all. As you all are probably very well aware, the American government has decided to open up a consulate in Jerusalem for so-called Palestinian affairs. And that consulate is not going to be in Abu Dis, which is an Arab neighborhood of Jerusalem, as bad as that would be. But that consulate will most likely be in the old American consulate on Agron Street, which is not far from Mamila, in the part of Jerusalem that is considered Western Jerusalem. So to add insult to injury, it appears that the Biden administration is going to open up a consulate for a foreign people in the middle of our capital. Now, I'm sure I don't have to tell you all that in order to open up a diplomatic representation in another country, you must, according to diplomatic procedure and international law, receive the permission of the host country to open up that diplomatic representation. If Israel wants to open up a consulate in Bergen, New Jersey, the American government must respond positively to that request. The only way the United States government can open up a consulate for so-called Palestinian affairs in Yerushalayim is by doing it with the approval of the Israel Foreign Ministry. If and when the Israel Foreign Ministry gives formal approval to that request, which I have a sneaking feeling it will, it's basically saying that there is no unified Yerushalayim, and that all of Yerushalayim is on the table. Worrisome, troublesome, scary. The good news is that, and this is something I could tell you from the depth of my heart, that the work I do with the Israel Independence Fund, and a lot of that work is done together with our friends in AFSI. And many of you have seen Israel Independence Fund projects when you've come to visit Israel. Leaves me with great optimism despite all these threats, because I deal with human resources on the ground. I deal with our boots on the ground. And as I deal with my boots on the ground, I meet the most wonderful, dedicated people that you can imagine. Since 2007, for these past years, the Israel Independence Fund has been active in incubating unique answers to the challenges that we face. When we were faced with the challenge of protecting Jewish farms and communities in Yehuda and the Shomron, we created HaShomer Yosh in order to provide volunteer days where people volunteer on farms to guard them. And we've been doing that for many years, a tremendously successful program. In response to the tremendous challenge of the lack of Jewish civil and religious rights on the Temple Mount, we created Biyadenu, Israel's premier initiative to ensure Jewish civil and religious rights on the Temple Mount and Israeli sovereignty on the Temple Mount by extension of those civil and religious rights. So despite the fact that I've spoken this evening about so many challenges and threats, I nonetheless feel very optimistic about Israel's future. We have the most dedicated people. We have the most wonderful people. I often refer to the number of young people who regularly volunteer for Israeli combat units as a mark as to where we are as a society and what our strength really is. And Baruch Hashem, it turns out that almost every year, Israel's combat units are oversubscribed, meaning that if the Tzanchanim need 10,000, 15,000 volunteer. And if Golani needs 8,000, 10,000 volunteer. So Baruch Hashem, we have young people who are willing to fight for this country, willing to protect this country at all costs, as a population as well, always in times of crisis, which I feel we are unfortunately increasingly headed towards. We have a population that is strong and that shows no fear at the worst of times. And that leaves me optimistic and hopeful for the future.
Do you want me to play the short video?
Well, perhaps before you, if I may, before you show that short video, I'd just like to mention a couple of words about Sderot and AFSI in Sderot. I think AFSI has been one of the first American organizations that really understood the depth of the threat to Sderot from missiles, and AFSI was there from the very beginning in order to show support for a population that was living in an atmosphere that could only be described as Stalingrad. And unfortunately, even just 3 days ago, Sderot was once again under attack, to a large extent because of the incessant Arab terrorism against Sderot. Sderot is a town where almost 35% of the population is needy. In honor of the coming new year, and in honor of AFSI and all AFSI has done for Sderot, I thought it most appropriate this evening to speak with everybody here this evening about the need to help the poor people of Sderot once again by providing food packages to the most needy from amongst them these coming high holy days. The food packages cost only $110 per family. They're food packages which would allow the families to have a proper Rosh Hashanah meal throughout the holiday and into the following week. And I can't think of anything more appropriate for us all to consider than providing families in need on the front line with a happy holiday and holiday wishes from all our friends throughout the world. I believe, Judy, now you're going to show a short film, a short video from our good friend Alon Davidi, the mayor of Sderot, who has been a true hero in leading Sderot to a better future. And he has helped to develop Sderot over the past couple of years beyond what anybody thought was possible, and he's done it all under fire. But the municipality needs our help, particularly in terms of this providing some type of support for the people most in need there in the coming holidays.
Hi everyone, it's I'm happy to recommend about Rabbi Avichai Amusi and his charity center that helped to a lot of families in Sderot. You know that Sderot is the front line against the Hamas. We stand proud and we live very close to Gaza. And you know, in this situation, many families need help to continue to live in this situation. So I want to say thank you very much to all the people that decide to help and have a good Rosh Hashanah and a good year for everyone.
So that was Alon, a wonderful man who really has turned Sderot from feeling like a battlefield into feeling like a beautiful community where people live and work and raise wonderful children in beautiful parks, all at the same time as being on the front line with Hamas. And it's miraculous, and I think in honor of the holidays, Aharon mentioned this project to me, and immediately I felt this is something everybody can do. It's not a huge thing. So the idea would be to make a donation to the Israel Independence Fund earmarked to Sderot. So if anybody has any questions about how you do that, Israel Independence Fund has a website. It can be done through the website. It can be done through Central Fund. If it needs to be done through, by getting the check to AFSI and we'll forward it on, that's fine also. But I would really, it would just, I think it would let us all go into the new year with a feeling of unity and strength. So I hope you can help out with that. We have a lot of questions. Helene, would you like to get started? Oh, somebody asked how many food baskets we need. They had asked us for 300. Is that correct?
That's correct. They've asked for 300 food baskets, and everybody can provide the funding simply by going to our website, and the address is really easy to remember, guys. It's www.fundisrael.org.
Okay. Um,
So let's get to the first question here. If I'm going to talk, Judy, I think you need to mute and vice versa. There we go. So the first question is from Murray Feldman, and he asks, are the US and the PA working now on a two-state solution? What about Jerusalem, international city divided between capital of a Palestinian state and Israel?
I can attest, it's a great question, Murray. I'm not privy to discussions between the American government and the PA, but dollars to donuts, what they are talking about is a two-state solution. What they're clearly talking about is Israel abrogating its rights to Area C, because we see for the first time that the Israel government is allowing Arabs to build in Area C legally, whereas previously we know the Israeli government has only allowed them to build illegally, and they certainly did a lot of that. But they're now allowing them to build legally as well, which is worrisome. So I think that the lines are clearly drawn in the sand. The American government is working with the PA in order to force a two-state solution on Israel. And clearly that two-state solution is going to include demands on Israel in terms of Yerushalayim.
okay. The next question is from Abe Beta. He'd like you to address the threat to Israel from gifted stockpiles of weapons, aircraft, and vehicles that obviously the U.S. left behind and were taken over by the Taliban.
From the unofficial reports that I've read, and I'm afraid you're going to have to mute, Judy. Okay, you did. From the unofficial reports that I've read, and from the unconfirmed reports that I've read that you could all read in the press, hundreds of millions of dollars of American arms have either been abandoned to the Taliban or have crossed the border into Iran. And it wouldn't surprise me in the least if a lot of that winds up in the hands of ISIS and in the hands of our enemies on the north, on the east, on the south, anywhere surrounding our borders. It's also clear that major efforts have been made to smuggle arms over the Lebanese border into Israeli Arab communities. In fact, a recent interview with our good friend Efie Tam last Friday in Israel Hayom points to the fact that most likely Israeli Arabs have already created militias that are based on arms that have been illegally smuggled from Lebanon into Israel. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of those arms also find their ways into villages throughout the Galilee. So yes, there's much to be concerned about.
All right, let's see. I'm going to ask you two questions here, because one is for you just to give us your thoughts on, which is the wildfires, if there's any relation to terrorism or it's just something that's happening. But Laureen Lipsky asks, why is it that when the Abraham Accord countries establish embassies in Israel, they are going to be located in Tel Aviv? How is it that it was not negotiated that embassies will only be located in Israel's actual capital, Jerusalem? And I'd like to add a bit of a follow-up, because Jerusalem was annexed in 1980 by law, internationally accepted, and this continues to be a question which you also brought up with regard to the PA, which makes no sense at all to me. So if you want to talk about that a little bit, please.
Firstly, briefly about the fires in the area of Yerushalayim. Israel's firefighting organization and the firefighters and the government itself has not laid direct blame in any direction, which leads me to believe that it's clearly an act of terrorism. One of the things that we're seeing happening today is that the level of truthfulness in reporting what's going on in Israel today has changed. And that's changed as a result of the politics within the government. Just to give you all an idea, and you might not have known this, the IDF is no longer required to report on wounded IDF soldiers if they are not severely wounded. So the number of IDF soldiers who are wounded in Yehuda v'Shomron by Arab rioters is no longer a matter of public record. That's because the government doesn't want it to be a matter of public record. And to the same extent that the IDF is no longer allowed to report on IDF soldiers who are lightly or moderately wounded, the firefighters have not directly reported on whether this is clear outright arson or not. The only thing they've said so far is that the fires started at different flash points, which basically means that it was arson and terror. But the government is not saying it outright, and they're hoping that they'll get a pass on it so they don't upset their coalition partners. And the second question was, just remind me, please.
Second question was about embassies.
Yes. I don't know why the Abraham Accords did not clearly define Jerusalem as the place where embassies must be placed. I can only say that Israel for decades has given a pass to the United States, to European countries, to people who are considered our best friends, not to transfer their embassies from Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim. And I don't think it surprised anybody that the Abraham Accords did not require it. The question begs to be asked whether it should have been insisted upon by the government. And I don't know. Probably yes. But if that would have been a deal breaker, frankly, I don't think Bibi Netanyahu would have let it pass.
And our friend Cheryl Jacobs-Lewin wants to know what you think the likelihood is of this current government falling.
It's truly hard to say. The current government can only fall through a no confidence motion that is carried by a majority of Knesset members by 61. The government has consistently failed to pass its own legislation because it can't reach 61, but failing to pass legislation is not automatically a no confidence motion. A no confidence motion has to be declared such before it's proposed to the Knesset. And then, of course, the government has time to bring in everybody, even if on a stretcher, in order to vote confidence in the government. I don't think this government will last 4 years, but to predict when it will fall is impossible.
And from Leon, please forgive me
if I may, I can add one more thing to that comment, and that is that it could well be that our greatest strategic ally causes the government to fall. And our greatest strategic ally has always been the Arabs. If and when the Arabs attack Israel in a manner that absolutely requires the government to make a clear military statement or clearly defend the lives of our citizens because they're in clear and present danger, if they force our hand to that extent that Naftali Bennett has to go to war, the government will fall because his coalition partners will leave him.
Of course, that's a frightening thought for a million reasons, but only one that's not. From Leon Smeda, I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. He writes, Aharon, shalom, and thank you for sharing your expertise. I read this morning that the government of Israel, via the IDF civil administration, issued a disruptive use order to uproot 170 dunam vineyard in Achia Farms in Shiloh. The courts have established no Arab claims to the land. His question is, what do you think the motivation is behind this action? And also he applauds Arzot Habrit.
The civil administration in Judea and Samaria is antagonistic to Jewish communities throughout Judea and Samaria, always has been. The civil administration is run by people who have an extreme left vision of what should be in Yehuda v'Shomron, and it comes as no surprise. However, what they've done is based on Supreme Court rulings that allow prejudice to Arab ownership of land, even if it is disproved. Meaning that if there is a question raised by the civil administration as to ownership of land, even if there is no Arab petitioner for the ownership, it must be pre-presumed, according to Israel's inane Supreme Court, that the ownership is Arab. This despite the fact that by all accounts, over 79% of the land in Judea and Samaria are state lands. So it comes as no shock.
From Mark Karoff, talking about wishful thinking and the facts that, one, latest estimates are that Iran is at most 3 months from having a nuclear weapon. 2, the U.S. Biden administration is engaged in extreme wishful thinking vis-a-vis stopping Iran acquiring nukes, even more so than when the U.S. failed to stop North Korea from developing nukes. Isn't it time that Israel pulls out all the stops in taking definitive action against Iran's nuclear weapons development, with or without a green light from the U.S., which obviously will never be forthcoming?
Up until now, as I mentioned previously, Israel's defense policy was based on independent thought and independent action. It is since the new government has taken control, since the new government was elected, that has changed, and now, as Naftali Bennett has promised publicly, a no surprise policy towards the American administration is now in effect. So I don't believe for a second that if Israel thought it necessary to conduct a wide, broad military campaign against Iranian nuclear capabilities, it would be allowed, it would be green lighted by the Biden administration of all people. On the other hand, Israel has thus far excelled at black ops against Iranian targets. Perhaps the Bennett government will continue with those. But once again, as long as there's a no surprise policy in effect with the American administration, I don't know if that's going to happen either. It's troublesome. It's troublesome. Clearly, the breakout time for an Iranian nuclear weapon is shortening every day, as every day goes by. How the present Israeli government will deal with that threat is not promising. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I thought I unmuted. This might be the last question because we're getting close to time. So from Mark Kardoff, General Avivi of, I always pronounce this wrong, Habithonistim has said,
yes.
has said during a recent AFC webinar that sovereignty over the Temple Mount, as well as the rest of Jerusalem, is an essential component of Israel's national security. Given that, and that Israel's egregious dereliction of duty in preservation and protection of these vital assets, do you see any chance that the Israeli government will make a paradigm shift in taking this issue seriously? I think this almost wraps up what you've said already. So
frankly, I don't see the Israeli government making any change in policy concerning the Temple Mount. I can tell you that I personally had a conversation with Naftali Bennett about the Temple Mount many years ago. And at that time, I discussed with him the central issue of Jewish civil and religious rights on the Temple Mount. And he said he found the conversation interesting and he understood the problem. However, I see that the government is not about to change policy at all. Rather, that the government is even genuflecting deeper than the previous government to the Hashemite kingdom when it comes to issues concerning the Temple Mount, and I'm concerned about that. Naftali Bennett recently went to Amman, as you're all probably aware, and he went with a gift of 50 million cubes of Israeli water for the Jordanian population. And that's in addition to the 50 million cubes we already give them that was sort of grandfathered into the peace agreement by Yitzhak Rabin. I don't see any change happening on the Temple Mount. Having said that, the Israel Independence Fund's Temple Mount initiative works diligently. We've created a Knesset lobby for the Temple Mount, which is headed by MKs May Golan and Simcha Rothman. And we work with MKs daily, speaking to them, advocating for change in the Temple Mount, reminding them about the importance of the Temple Mount from a religious and strategic perspective. In fact, we have guides that provide free tours to the Temple Mount, and the Bitchonistim were accompanied on their Temple Mount visit by the head of our initiative, Tom Nisani, and by guides that were specially trained by the Israel Independence Fund. I wish I could say that I saw change on the horizon, but frankly, I don't. Jews are still allowed up on the Temple Mount for only 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. Jews are not allowed on the Temple Mount on Fridays and on Shabbat. Jews are not allowed to go in through the 11 gates to the Temple Mount, but only one. Discrimination against Jews continues to be rampant in everything to do with the Temple Mount. And it's a situation that must change and that we're working diligently to change. However, I don't see the government adopting change. In order for change to occur in the Temple Mount, you and I and all Am Yisrael must get together and first of all ascend to the Temple Mount regularly and show Jewish boots on the ground on the Temple Mount and clearly demand of the Israeli government a change in policy.
I think on that note, we've hit 2 o'clock, and that was a really good note to end on, because my feeling, I know your feeling, is that whoever controls the Temple Mount, whoever controls Jerusalem, I mean, it has to be the Jewish people. And what can we do? We can put our boots on the ground and go and visit, and hopefully we'll be able to do that very, very soon. I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to really give a very, very special thanks to Aharon. Again, we have so many more questions. There's always so much more to discuss, and maybe we'll have to do this again soon. So I wish everybody a good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. Hopefully we will next time. And stay well.
Judy, if I may, I'd like to wish everybody a happy and healthy New Year, and hope to see you all soon.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. Happy, healthy New Year to all of you, although I hope to see you before then. So, Be well. Shalom.